Let's get started. The International Parking and Mobility Institute is pleased to present this webinar titled, How Safe Are Your Parking Facilities? Best Practices and Operations to Protect Your Patrons and the Public. My name is Kenny and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. If you need assistance at any time during the program, please raise your hand or use the chat feature and we will assist you. Today's presentation will last 90 minutes and will include specific question and answer periods. However, you can queue up a question for us at any time during today's presentation. To enter a question through the webinar system, simply click the Q&A tab, type your question, and press enter. All registrants participants will receive an archived version of this presentation in a few days. It is now my pleasure to introduce Rachel Yoka to get us started. Rachel, the audience is all yours.
Thank you, Kenny, and thanks so much for joining us today. As you may know, in recent events, there's been lots of news about parking garage safety, maintenance, and all the things that we should be doing on a regular basis. So IPMI took this opportunity to convene some of our most leading experts in the space to share some knowledge with you that we hope will help to avoid those situations in the future. Before we jump to our expert presenters and moderator today, I'm going to pass it to Gary Means, our chair of our board of directors, to say a few words.
Oh, thank you so much, Rachel. I'm honored to be here, and man, what a important topic. And I can see by the number of attendees, it's important to everybody else. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from this expert panel. You know, we all deal with so many things in the parking and mobility industry, but I would say, at least here in Lexington and with my board of directors, safety is number one and at the top of the list. And so I can't wait to hear what they have to talk about and share with us and educate us on. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Brett Munkel, and let him take it from here. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Gary. And again, we'll just go around the table, introduce ourselves. Got a great panel here. My name is Brett Munkel. For those of you who don't know me, I work with SP Plus. We're a parking operations company. My background in the industry goes on for about 19 years. So I've been with civil engineers, with structural engineers, consultancies, and with on the operations side of the table for the better part of the past 15 or 16 years. So very happy to be here. Pass it on to Blake.
Yeah, good afternoon, Blake Hodge. I'm a structural engineering and parking consulting practice leader at Kimley Horn based in Dallas, Texas. So glad to be here to share some thoughts with you as well.
I'm Rob McConnell, one of the principals at WGI. Some of you may recall WGI by our former name of Carl Walker, but yeah, we've been around for a while, and I am going on now 30 years in the parking biz, so glad to be here.
Hey, hi, good afternoon and good morning. This is Mark Santos. I am with Walker Consultants. I serve as their Director of Operations based out of Fort Lauderdale. Over 23 years of experience all in parking, planning, design, restoration. I look forward to joining this group and chatting a little more with the folks here.
Thanks, Mark. We'll go over a little bit about what we're looking to do today. And so, number one, we're looking at what's most important about the parking facilities that we all interact with, and that being the safety and welfare of those who use it. And so it's been in the headlines as of late, and so it's a very timely discussion, and excited to kind of dive into the details. So as best we know how, we're going to share our insight and experiences, and got a good roundtable here. Want to share some best practices, top of the wave guidance along the lines of how to assess the facilities and look at operational standards. So the scope, the initial focus, we're going to be looking at life safety and structural considerations. So obviously just looking at the design criteria. Then we're going to dive into a little bit about MEP, EVs, and how they relate to existing design, new design, ADA guidelines, etc. And we do have an appendix that will be shared. So the resources, you don't need to take great notes, because we're going to share what we have here, as well as resources for additional information. Just a little housekeeping to get started. We want to understand a little bit more about who's in the room with us here today. So we're going to send out a survey. Go ahead and send that out now if we can. If you would click through that.
So just a note, there are 2 questions. So if your role applies to the first bucket and not the second bucket, just answer the questions you can. You can skip the others.
Yes, please make sure to scroll down or maximize the poll window to see all the answers. Give everybody about another 30 seconds here. Great. Gonna share the results now.
Excellent. So it looks like we have obviously a lot of folks who know a little bit more than the 101 level class. And so we're going to reaffirm a lot of what you know, add to it where we can. Yeah, so it looks like we have a knowledgeable audience, which is always a good thing. With that said, I think we'll go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Blake Hodge.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. So as we begin to frame this conversation, one thing that we like to tell our clients and tell owners is that the mindset we need to have for maintaining this infrastructure, and it is, parking is infrastructure, and so it should be treated as such, but it's really maintaining this asset in a similar way that you would think about maintaining a home or a car. Something that you own that you want to maintain the value of, you want to get good service life out of. And so just as we begin to think about this, think about that in terms of how you maintain an asset. And with that, you maintain an asset in a couple of different ways. Certainly there's routine maintenance that you do. For parking, it's housekeeping. For a car, it's putting gas in, changing your oil. There's some things that's preventative that you probably should do. Again, for a home, maybe it's cleaning your air filter. For a car, it's changing and rotating your tires. For a parking asset, maybe it's doing some proactive things relative to waterproofing or, lighting. And then finally, there's some things that you want to do. And so certainly in your home and in your car, there's some things that you want to do to maintain it, keep it going. And in that same vein, as you begin to think of parking as an asset, it's good to think about what you have to do, what you should do, and what you want to do. So if you keep those 3 questions in your mind as we go through the presentation, I think it'll be helpful and sort of layer in a flavor of understanding of the topics we're trying to convey. I think we're doing another poll question. Is that right, Brett?
Yes, we do have one more. So this is kind of assessment of how you currently approach or what your thoughts are around how often your facilities should be assessed. Give it another second or two, and then we'll look at the results here.
Yeah, the results.
All right. So every year, every 3 years, every 3 to 5 years.
All good answers. I would say, generally speaking, it's like everything else. It's a factor of where are you geographically located, and we'll talk about that, how old your facility is. Most of the professionals like on this call would say every 3 to 5 years, depending on the age of your facility, you need to have a good assessment done. And we'll talk about what that means. It involves structural items. It involves operational items, lighting, equipment. It involves waterproofing. It involves life safety reviews, things of that nature. So again, why are we talking about this? I'm sure you know that there's been many articles, many things that you've been hearing in the news, and that prompted this conversation and this topic. And we just want to make sure that you have a good understanding of recommendations from the industry and recommendations from a few professionals on the panel. And so with that, maybe next slide, Rachel. So we talked about things that you have to do, things that you should do, and things that you want to do. And we all know that there's some environmental factors associated with those, things from the elements, things of where you are, but there's also factors outside the environment. There's drivers, there's people that do damage to our facilities, and we need to understand and plan for those as well. So when we begin to talk about how do we plan for these items, both the unknown and the known that we can plan for, just an idea of having one, budget set aside for these items, and two, a consultant, either through an on-call or a go-to consultant that you can interact with to address these issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my partner to get in a little bit more details on the fundamental of the design of the facilities we're talking about.
Sure, thanks, Blake. No, I love some of those photos. You never know. The structure is easy to deal with compared to the human factor. I'm going to review a few topics here, and at least at the outset here, I'm going to try to digest, all of structural engineering, durability design, maintenance, and everything, and distill it down into about 7 slides here. So bear with me as I run through these and understand there's a lot more depth to this. But starting off, if you want to roll it one forward. I'm going to talk briefly about the different types of structures here. Got a few images on the left there of different types of structures. The top one is a cast-in-place post-tension concrete facility, and directly below it, you've got a couple different variations on conventionally reinforced. In other words, non-pre-stressed structures that are concrete, precast, pre-stressed, which is probably your most common type of structures, the bottom right corner. And then occasionally you see steel, either with or without metal deck. A lot of times in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, you'll see more steel structures perhaps than you will elsewhere. And each one of these structures, number one, there's concrete in all of them because concrete is typically the driving surface. I can't think if I've ever seen a structure that didn't have a concrete floor in it. So you have to deal with concrete and all its strengths and its weaknesses. And each type of structure has its pros and cons. Dealing with each, you're going to have to address each a little differently. And just as I mentioned previously, precast is probably the most prevalent, but by far and away, precast and cast-in-place post-tension make up the vast majority of structures out there. So understand what kind of structure you have. That's the first step. Second thing to consider is new construction versus existing construction and the maintenance associated with that. Typically speaking, new construction is going to be designed, using the latest design techniques and the latest building codes. Codes change over time, and structural design to a certain extent, becomes obsolete. Although it's still, buildings don't fall down after the codes change, generally speaking. But for example, earthquakes before the early 1990s, outside of the West Coast, very few places in the United States designed for earthquake loads. The wind codes just changed recently, and now they're more strenuous. Fire, those of you who have new structures or are planning new structures may be aware that in the 2021 version of the International Building Code, there's now a requirement that any structure over 48,000 square feet have fire sprinkling, regardless of whether it's open or not, and that's coming out of a couple pretty nasty fires in Europe. Life safety requirements change. Salt usage in the early 70s ramped up to something like 10 times what it had been in the 1950s. So things change, and your building, your garage is there, and it's obviously there's certain things you can do to update it, but you're once it's built, you have what you have in terms of the design. And with that said, every facility, regardless of the age of it, needs some degree of maintenance starting from day one. Blake mentioned preventative and routine maintenance. That's the housekeeping and the touch-up painting and the restriping periodically, and fixing your leaks here and there. And just to in addition to whatever repairs might have to be done over the years, typically speaking, sealants and coatings most of them are going to come with a 5-year warranty, and that translates to about a 7 to 10 year lifespan. So you should be thinking about replacing your sealants and your coatings, your waterproofing coatings, about 7 to 10 year intervals. Roofing and plaza waterproofing systems a little bit longer than that, in the 20-25 year range. LED lamping, when they first came out, they said they had 100,000 hour life. Reality is they're somewhere in the 5 year, maybe 3 to 5 year range, depending on how they're used. Precast concrete flange connections, in particular, in pre-top systems, are going to deteriorate relatively rapidly. And then corrosion-induced deterioration, that's where water and salt gets down to the level of the embedded steel, the steel that's encased in concrete, and it starts to corrode and rust that steel. Depending on the age and the quality of the concrete used and some of the detailing, the concrete cover and everything, that could be anywhere from 10 years, a structure that's 10 years old, 20 years old, but at some point, chlorides and salt and whatnot are going to migrate down and start to exacerbate rusting. Here's an image of that we have kindly borrowed from American Concrete Institute 362. This is the guide for the design and construction of durable parking structures, and this is a resource that we've used for many years in the parking design industry. It divides the country up into zones. Again, it's not perfect, but it's a good resource to understand where you are and what you're dealing with, and how to design in a simplified way. It's based on freezing and thawing and salt usage and other aspects, precipitation and whatnot in the various parts of the country. But this type of exposure to salts in particular and moisture in particular is not just limited to the upper Midwest and the Northeast and the mountain states. On the coasts, you have airborne salts coming off the water, and the corrosion zone, the durability zone that ACI suggests for structures within about a half a mile of the water is the same as it does for the upper Midwest and the northeastern United States. Just that volume of salt. So your maintenance and requirements and whatnot are going to be dependent not only about where you are and how much salt usage, but what type of system you have, whether the concrete is pre-stressed or not. In other words, pre-compressed, which will help limit cracking. Conventionally reinforced concrete is going to crack just as a part of its performance. And I showed you a picture of a metal plant, a metal pan system, stay in place metal deck. Those are notorious for trapping moisture between the bottom of the concrete slab and the pan, and so that freezes and thaws and rusts, and that has all sorts of other problems as well. This is a curve, and don't worry too much about what the units are. What it's intended to illustrate is that the longer you put off a repair, regardless of what that repair is, the more rapidly it's going to accelerate, and at some point it's going to get to a level where it's not manageable. And that is absolutely true for concrete deterioration. And then you've got the curve that's along the bottom, the straight line that's along the bottom there that says, if you manage the deterioration, it's a process and a known quantity. If you stay on top of it, it doesn't get out of control. Here's an example. Mark said it looks a little bit like snakes and ladders, but it hopefully is an effective graphic here. An example would be a leaking crack or a leaking joint. If you noticed in a garage that you had a leaking crack or a leaking joint, your inclination might be to say, well, that's just one spot. I'll catch that, next time around, when we replace the sealants in a couple years. Well, that to replace that sealant, it might cost you $5 a linear foot. If there's not much of it, it might even be as much as $10 a linear foot, but it's peanuts compared to what you're going to have to deal with if that joint continues to leak and lets in salts and moisture into the crack and rusts that causes the embedded rebar to rust. And when the rust expands, it causes delamination. We're going to talk a little bit and show you some pictures a little bit later about that. But to fix a delamination is going to run you somewhere, in that $50 to $100 a square foot range. So you're talking orders of magnitude above that $5 linear foot repair. And then if you just let it go and you say, well, I'll catch that next time, it gets more and more and more expensive, and eventually you get to the point where portions of your garage or maybe the whole garage becomes unserviceable and unusable. And you lose not only the money it takes to fix that, at such time you decide to fix it, but also whatever sort of revenue you might be, taking in for being able to use that part of the asset. And one more thing here, maintenance is not just about the structural piece of a parking structure project. It's all of the garage's systems need review and TLC over the course of the life of the garage. These include plumbing systems and electrical and lighting and the parking access and revenue and parking guidance systems and security systems and so on. And then in addition to that, you want to keep up the aesthetic features of it. People need to be comfortable, need to feel safe and secure in a garage. And part of that is keeping your finishes up and keeping things clean and nice and well lit, and keeping the general appearance of the facility such that you're attracting customers. I'm going to turn it over to Mark. Mark's going to talk a little bit about some other stuff here.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Yep. So in addition to some of the structural information Rob had went over, along with those operational and aesthetic components, kind of want to do a little bit of a deeper dive and talk about the overall facility components. As you can see there in the bullets, we're going to chat about functional design, signage and parks, stairs and elevators, and we'll dive into MEP towards the end of that particular program. So with functional design, I'm sure we have a lot of examples of good functional design and maybe others that need some improvement. But the whole idea with, designing parking garages and facilities and mixed use types, the goal is to have efficient layouts. The goal is to have streamlined vehicular flow and, of course, comfortable maneuvers. And how we kind of wrap that up as an industry is how we label that term as functional design. Some key design aspects, as you can probably relate from your facilities, where are the entry exit locations? Is there one-way flow versus two-way? What are the types of users? Are they parking all day, or is there a lot of turnover and transactions? How are the ramps oriented? Are they in the right spot, and are there more than one? So while those areas are pretty important to functional design, we also cannot forget about, trying to minimize cross traffic within the facility. Of course, trying to minimize pedestrian conflicts with any types of vehicles, and also properly locating and placing stairs and elevators to where most folks are at their point of destination where we'd like to head. Next slide, Rachel. Probably one of the most visible pieces for your patrons that they typically see upon arrival are, your signage and if there is any type of parking and access revenue control. So from a signage standpoint, there's sometimes there could be too much signage. So what is that balance between quantity and content? As we kind of talk about these areas with your facilities, how do they relate to what you see day in and day out? Are your signage messages clear and concise, or maybe there's too much information? Are they placed in the proper location to allow patrons to really understand what they need to know at the proper time? These are just a few examples you can see here when you analyze your own facilities. From a parking equipment standpoint, also many owners are interested in whether it's asset light or less equipment. But at the end of the day, most owners are looking for something to be more convenient for their patrons. Maybe it's the right time for upgrades, or maybe it's the right time to consider upgrades. But what we typically talk about as well from our standpoint is, what are the viewpoints and the benefits from the user standpoint, of course, but also from, the owner side, the operator side. Are there any advantages with enforcement or available data? Those kind of questions that come to mind. The third piece is really talking about vertical circulation or stairs and elevators. Obviously very familiar with what these are. They do provide not only just the vertical circulation for, between levels, but they are a part of your life safety system for egress. In that event of an emergency or something to that event, your stairs are part of that life safety component. Whether it's, your guardrails providing protection, fall protection for your patrons, protecting the minimizing the conflicts between vehicles and pedestrians. Again, you can see a lot of the bollards that are in these particular photos providing that level of protection. A few other things to consider with your stairs and elevators, there's typically maybe one or two that are more prominently used than others. And sometimes it could be easier to forget about some of those egress stairs are the ones that are really only possibly going to use for an emergency type conditions, and definitely want to make sure that patrons are safe, minimizing any types of tripping hazards, things of those natures to ensure, full safe components, not just in the parking areas, but also in the stairs and elevators. And lastly here is more of a helping with the overall performance of the parking structure itself. We could spend a lot of time talking about MEP, and I know we're gonna have a little discussion. I think we're getting some questions about, what are the impacts of EV and those loads, and we'll kind of chat about that towards the end, because I know that's definitely on folks' minds. But as far as your typical MEP or mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, obviously your lighting systems are super important to provide a safe and secure environment. Are there areas of your parking garage that are painted, as you can see in some of the examples, to help provide some more increased visibility and increased lighting levels? The picture at the top right, while it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, and I'm talking about the plumbing and drainage system, unless there's an issue. So making sure that your drainage system is clean, so there is not ponding water and things that could then lead to leaks in other locations. As Blake and Rob tried to mention, it's really trying to stay ahead for the most part of some of these systems. And then also fire suppression, as Rob mentioned, that's definitely something that I think a lot of us are in tune with, but as the codes change, it's going to be more prominent in having sprinkler systems, and what does that really mean, not just from a cost standpoint, but from a maintenance standpoint as well. So that kind of wraps up more of the support systems. I'll turn it back over to Rob to a little deeper dive on specifics of maintenance and restoration.
Sure. So what I want to do is I want to run through some pretty typical types of deterioration that you might see in a parking facility. And granted, some of these pictures are a little bit on the more extreme end, but they are, they are characteristic of what you might see. That way, as you're walking through a garage and doing your in-house review, you could train your staff to kind of keep these things in mind. And if you see something that looks problematic, and maybe you can relate it to some of these images, and I'll also try to give a sense of, at what point these indicate a really significant problem versus maybe a serviceability problem or an aesthetic problem. So the first is concrete cracking. All concrete cracks. That's part of the way it's designed. Some cracking is worse than others. The image on the left there is actually cracks due to overloading. It was in this particular facility, they were driving loaded forklifts in the garage, and it literally broke the floor. So we had to strengthen the floor to address those, and then deal with the waterproofing aspect of the cracks. The image in the middle is typical of what you might see for plastic shrinkage cracking or possibly drying shrinkage cracking. That's usually indicative of the moisture in the during the curing process for the concrete, the moisture in the very top of the slab evaporating too quickly, and the very top layer of the concrete drying out and cracking before the rest of the slab is cured out. Those cracks and compared to the structural cracks on the left, those cracks are very shallow. The shrinkage cracks are, and typically they're not structural, although they do need to be addressed because over time it can lead to deterioration of the top surface. The image on the right there, that's kind of the extreme condition of leaking cracks. Those cracks have been leaking for decades and nobody's done anything about them, and you can see stalactites forming. Not only is that leaching out the calcium out of the concrete, which is part of the protective layer in the concrete, you can just imagine how much rust and corrosion is on the reinforcement in that area, and I can imagine that most of that is probably delaminated and will start coming down sooner or later. So when you get leaking cracks and moisture in concrete, you get corrosion, and the corrosion product is rust, and rust is significantly has significantly more volume than the steel itself. So when the rust forms, it creates an outward pressure on the concrete, and concrete's great in compression. It's not good in tension. It can take about 10% of the stress in tension that it can in compression. So when you get that outward pressure, it pops the concrete off. And in every one of these images, with the exception of the famous rope repair up there in the top right, you can see exposed rebar that is rusted and push that concrete cause that concrete to spall off. Spalling is another word for concrete delamination. The rope repair is an extreme example of somebody deferring maintenance, not wanting to spend the money to actually repair something in the proper fashion. The next slide, not only when steel rusts, not only does it cause the concrete to delaminate, it also causes you to lose the steel itself, the section or the cross section of the steel gets reduced and reduced every time you generate more rust, and sooner or later you lose the ability of that steel to support anything. Or in the case of a post-tensioning tendons, like you see on the left there in the image on the left, you start losing. These are 7-wire strands. Typically, you lose a wire. Yeah, maybe it doesn't do anything. You lose another wire, and all of a sudden, the remaining 5 wires or 4 wires don't have the capacity to hold that pre-stressing load, and they break and explode, up out of the slab. And that's what you're seeing, that the multiple broken tendons there from corrosion somewhere out away from this point, where enough of the wires in the strand rusted to where the rest of the tendon couldn't support them, and it caused a failure there. The image in the middle, what looks like grease coming out of a crack, that's exactly what it is. It's grease from a post-tensioning tendon that has failed and ruptured. The post-tensioning tendons typically have sheathing around them. Some of the older ones are paper wrapped, and some of the really old ones don't have anything. But most of the tendons that have been put in the last 30-35 years have like a polypropylene sheathing on it, and it's got a grease that's in that sheathing to keep the moisture out of it. And if something happens to the sheathing, it gets compromised. You can see leaking grease if the tendon fails somehow and ruptures the sheathing, then you can get leaking grease, and that's an indication that you got a problem, a structural problem. Another type of deterioration that you see, particularly in the northern climes where you get lots of freeze-thaw cycles, is scaling. And what causes this is moisture gets down into the top layer of the concrete, and when water freezes, if you remember your elementary school science experiments, when water freezes, it grows, it expands, and if the concrete doesn't have air bubbles in it, air entrainment, or if when they finished the concrete, they really got on it and brought the paste up and really overworked the top layer, it probably took all the air out of it. And so when that moisture goes down into the concrete, because it will penetrate concrete, concrete's it's got a bunch of capillaries in it, it's like a hard sponge. When that moisture gets down in there and freezes, it doesn't have anywhere to go. There's no air bubbles for it to go into. And so it's similar to what happens when the steel rusts, is it puts this outward pressure and just breaks the top level of the concrete off. Starts off usually, fractions of an inch, 1/16 of an inch, maybe in the top surface, but over time, it will eat away the top surface and expose the aggregate, as you can see in the images, and that aggregate, that the stones will work their way loose, and you'll get gravel just kind of all over the surface, and it'll get bad until you do something about it. It's typically not a structural issue, but as it gets worse and worse and worse, these areas become less and less useful and usable and serviceable. Precast has some of its own peculiarities. You can see a few here. You've got a bearing failure up in the top left corner where the ledge that the double T stem is sitting on has broken off, either because of eccentric loading or perhaps the embedded reinforcement wasn't in quite the right place. The top middle picture, that's an example of the bearing pad, which is part of what gives the precast system a certain amount of flexibility. That bearing pad is walked off the ledge probably due to the cyclical nature of, the volume change. When garages are pretty dynamic animals. They expand when it gets hot and they shrink when it gets cold, and they're always moving. Most of them move, expand and contract somewhere in the order of about an inch or so each way a year. So as that happens, things move. Also, precast structures tend to be a little bouncy, and as the cars drive over it, that movement can cause those bearing pads to walk out. The image on the right and the image on the bottom left are somewhat related. Those are double T flange connections, and different types of failures associated with that. Again, caused by movement, up and down movement, volume change movement, and water and rusting over time in those, and they will break and sometimes cause the concrete around it to crack and spall. The pre-topped decks, the decks that have factory installed topping versus field cast in place concrete topping applied in the field, tend to be more vulnerable to this than others. One thing that you really should strive to do is try to keep as much of the standing water off of the surfaces as practical. It's ironic because drainage, excellent drainage in the designing in excellent drainage really doesn't cost anything, but for whatever reason, it's often neglected. And when you don't have excellent drainage in the structure, you get things like these images here, with big ponds and bird baths, sometimes in really bad places, like right at the bottom of the stair landing. This water is going to migrate through the concrete. It might freeze if you're in a environment subject to freezing. That will accelerate scaling. It will accelerate intrusion of chlorides. You got this gentleman up here in the top left who's putting salt out on the deck. Somebody had a question earlier about use of non-chloride ice melters versus chloride ice melters. Obviously, it's beneficial to use non-chloride ice melters, but they tend to be more expensive than good old rock salt. So a lot of people use the old school type of ice melt, and of course that just dumps more chloride on the deck and accelerates corrosion. Other things to kind of look at. Here's some examples of guardrail failures. Fortunately, no one was hurt when the spandrel fell off the deck there. That was bumped into by a car on the inside, and because of deferred maintenance, nobody had paid any attention to the connections that were holding that spandrel in place, and it destroyed a semi-trailer there. But like I said, fortunately, no one was hurt. The image in the middle that's an out of date, a guardrail that would no longer meet any sort of current building code. And thankfully, when the person accidentally stepped on the gas instead of the brake pedal, thankfully they hit the column, which stopped them from going off the deck there. So that not only do those need to be maintained, a lot of times they need to be updated and upgraded. Just because you are grandfathered under a previous code doesn't mean that it's not an obligation to keep the garage safe, and this would be an example of that. Another issue that is fairly common is expansion joint failure. The image in the bottom there is classic snowplow damage, and you know that there's ways to mitigate that, but when you get that kind of damage, that joint's no longer going to be watertight. Lastly, we got some examples of failed joint sealants and failed coatings. The images on the left are primarily precast, but that doesn't mean that cast in place post-tension concrete is exempt from that as well. And then on the right, you've got a few different examples. You've got coatings that have failed in adhesion to the surface. In other words, the adhesive nature of the coating has disappeared and it's pulling away. And the bottom image there, you actually have wear, where you're getting wear in areas of high traffic, and those are different types of failures that you can have in coatings. I'm going to hand it back over to Brad here. He's going to, I think, moderate some Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. No, I appreciate it. And we've got some good questions coming in, and this is kind of a good opportunity to take a deep breath. There's a lot of information that was shared, and we're happy to provide responses. So we have some moderated Q&A, and Rob did key in on one thing that I personally, I'm not an engineer, I'm not technical, but these are, I tend to think of parking structures as big monolithic structures, but they're living and breathing, they're moving. And with that movement, there's deterioration in ways that you might not anticipate. So looking at it under that context provides a really good perspective, I think. I'll jump into the questions and answer as I can and open it up to the group. So Jefferson Inman asked, how do you inspire parking contractors for a city to be proactive with their security measures? I would also like to point out there are a few questions that, or topics rather, that will be coming up a little further on in the presentation. But with respect to encouraging proactivity, make sure they know what they're looking for. So Rob gave some great examples of this is what these warning signs look for, and think of it, this is your patient, and what are the first indications of a fever, and what are areas to watch for, and make sure that you're recording it and tracking it and providing a path forward. With regard to below grade structures, Gabe Menendez asked, what items need to be addressed that we don't even think about with above grade, within above grade garage? And so I would submit that to the panel here at large.
Yeah, this is
Go ahead,
Gabe. I'd say one thing for below grade is first of all, a parking garage is a building per the building code. It has an occupancy classification. Think of it like any other building. It's just a different kind of building. And so there's really two kinds of buildings. There's an above grade open air garage that meets some certain openness requirements. Airflow can happen, gets rid of the carbon monoxide from the cars. Probably some of the biggest things we see in below grade parking are it generally needs ventilation. So it needs to bring in fresh air, and it needs to exhaust air that's full of carbon monoxide from the vehicles. And what we see in assessments of older garages is those systems, which are normally mechanical systems, they're fans and sensors and monitors, are not maintained. They don't work. So that's one thing to look for. They also generally are sprinklered, which is if you think of in your office, you look overhead and you see the sprinkler head. So you'll have a system like that in a below grade garage, generally speaking. And so those systems also need maintenance. I think we see a lot of leaking and cracking from the walls. So you don't see so much in the floor because generally there's a building or some infrastructure or plaza above. So maybe the things that Rob showed don't come from above, but they come from the sides. Those are some things to look for. And then also just this has been heavy structural, but a good assessment, like we mentioned earlier, is operational and everything else, like the mechanical systems. But lighting is probably a key that we see that we add to below grade parking just to make them feel safer. So I would say below grade parking. Mark or Rob, you may have something else to add, but those are the big things we see in below grade. So there's some aesthetic things, there's some really serious code things that we need to make sure happen, and there's some little different nuanced version of the structural elements.
Great response.
I'll-
Thanks, Blake.
I'll throw a couple things in there just real quick. Plaza waterproofing, if there's not a building above it, your plaza systems are pretty critical. And if you don't have adequate drainage and whatnot, and two-stage drains and all on your plaza systems, those can be a real headache. And another last thing, I hadn't mentioned anything about carbonation. Anytime you got an enclosed environment like a below grade situation, and your cars are giving off carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, that's absorbed into the concrete, and as more and more carbon dioxide, carbon in general, is absorbed into the concrete, it actually reduces the alkalinity of the concrete, which then speeds up corrosion.
Thanks, Rob. Richard Easley asked, in your experience, what percentage of garages, owners, operators out there are not keeping up with safe maintenance practices? Is it the same percentage for both publicly owned and privately owned facilities? And I would say in my experience, I see a pretty equal proportion between the two. So much of it just depends on whether or not they're appropriately planning, which we'll get into here in a moment, and then applying those funds to what they're intended for. COVID threw a big wrench into everyone's budgets, and the maintenance budgets provided a ready piggy bank that many kind of dipped their hands into. And so I think the most current years are going to be very telling for the industry. And if those maintenance items that were deferred or the funding that was pulled out really get addressed later on. Anyone else have a comment?
I would just say, generally, we see owners that own their asset for longer periods of time are more prone to maintain it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a public owner or a private owner. We have a lot of our clients that are private owners of retail that do a great job of maintaining because they own their assets for a long time. So I think a lot of what we see is what's the ownership structure of the asset, and that generally, again, goes back to that mindset. If I own it, I'm going to take care of it. If I know I'm going to sell it in 3 years, I may not do the things that I should do. Sorry, Mark, I think I interrupted you.
Nope, we're just on the same page, and I was just going to pretty much reiterate what Brett was mentioning. It's really, I think, a mixed bag, and we are going to talk about a few things, what we would, our group, and professional industry label as asset management, and really kind of getting that plan in place. But again, we've run into areas as well that some folks really need some help on how to plan for this. So it really is a mixed bag, but we're hopefully going to try to get everyone on the same page here in kind of the next segment.
Great. Yeah, we'll go ahead and dive right in. And Blake is up next.
Thanks. So we've talked about some of the ways to identify some areas that we want to maintain. Again, this whole idea of asset management, I think, is the proper way to think about maintenance. And again, it's not just structural, it's everything, it's operational. In fact, I was going to interject what we've seen actually quite a bit of recently is our elevator modernizations facilities. So it comes down to one, customer satisfaction, that they're not captured in an elevator, but it's also just a safety element. So that's something that we're seeing. That's part of asset management. But the whole concept is, again, we have an asset, we want to maintain it. What's our recommendation for the process? So we have this simple flow diagram, and it starts at the top, and it starts with assessment. So again, those assessments generally every 3 to 5 years, depending on what you see, what the people using and working in your facility see. But that assessment looks at the things Rob talked about. It looks at the things that Mark talked about in terms of functional and signage and operational. And that assessment, generally the output of that is a report, and that report has some recommended budgets, and it has some recommended buckets for those budgets. So we call them immediate repairs, near-term repairs, and long-term repairs. And so the assessment helps you to prioritize and budget. And once you prioritize and budget, then you can start getting those capital dollars in place to implement the plan. So the implementation of the plan, normally the third step is to actually do some repair plans. So get a professional consultant that will have plans with pictures and how to repair. Those plans go out and get bid just like new construction would. It's just a different nuanced version of construction. But to actually have a set of documents that someone is repairing your facility from. So that's the implementation piece. And then you operate and you monitor. And when you get actual repair plans done, you get them done by a professional contractor, then you start getting these things like the warranties that Rob talked about. And then you can get some repairs done under warranty. And then you implement, so maybe the first round of the circle is your phase 1 repairs, or your 1 to 3 year repairs. Then the next time around the circle, you do your 3 to 5 year plans. Then, so again, those goes back to the idea of the things that I have to do, the things I need to do, and the things I want to do. And so each of those is an iteration around the circle. So next slide. So what we're trying to move from is on the left is a diagram that indicates just a purely reactionary approach to asset management. So I see a problem, I go fix the problem. I get some money budgeted to me to maintain a facility. I go spend whatever money's available. I see an issue like a car drove through a barrier. I need to have a professional go look at it, issue me a report. And certainly there's a component of that. If you go back to what we talked about before, there's some things that happen environmentally, and there's some things that happen from your users. And so maybe what we want to do is the left side of this, the reactionary piece of this, is what's happening from your users, or things that we can't necessarily plan for. And I would recommend, again, you have a plan in place to deal with those. If it's an on-call consultant, someone that you can have to call when there's a car fire, when there's an accident, whenever you see something that looks alarming. Again, but what you're trying to do for the things that you can control is what's on the right. So be proactive, budget, repair, and have that as an ongoing cycle. And what we tell a lot of our clients is say, man, we have a really hard time getting to get money budgeted for repair. One thing that we say, if you look at like an office building, a lot of like the office building I sit in, we have a building engineer, a full-time building engineer that is maintaining the asset of the building. And then we have like a 3,000 car parking garage with my office building. And so that building engineer, he's responsible for maintaining the garage, but his focus is on the building. And so what we tell people is a garage is a building. And if you have a full-time asset manager for your occupied, or let's say conditioned and occupied, more traditional, what you think of as a building, a garage is also a building, and it needs, maybe not the same level of maybe daily asset management, but it needs some level of asset management. And that argument sort of helps develop some of the ongoing capital components of budgeting, and that's what we would recommend. And then it's a cycle. And then if you think back to the curve that Rob showed, instead of this, exponential curve of problems going fast, or problems causing deterioration that causes issues, and that happens quickly. If you have this cycle, you can flatten that curve and you really maintain the value of your asset. And that's what we're trying to do. So again, looking at immediate responses. There will always be a need for immediate responses. And again, our goal is to have those be primarily assigned to things outside of your control. But then there are things that we can program for, we can budget for, and just realize your garage is a building, and a building needs maintenance, and it needs improvement. And that allows you to plan for ultimately to get to the things that you want to. Mark, I think you're going to talk about some more of the planning associated with this asset management idea.
Yep. I'm going to kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive. So kind of the next two slides, really taking a step back and kind of think more about planning and how can we get to achieving our goals. With all of the things that Blake had described and Rob had described, specifically with identifiers, what does that all mean, and how do we get to a point where we can make sure that internally we're all on the same page, we have our leadership on the same page, we have the funding in place, and so really those are the few highlights I want to hit on the next few slides. But here, a couple quick points here. I mean, it's pretty important to have good record keeping, especially for those facilities that have had previous repairs. The past performance has a direct impact on the next steps and the path forward. Has there been regular maintenance completed, resulting in that manageable approach as one of the graphs that Rob showed earlier? Or should your department be aware that there's a significant increase in a budget to tackle maintenance and repairs that could have been manageable, but now they are above, that particular level of repair? Also, maintaining those records does provide a basis for technical assessments and again, a history of budgets. This, as your facilities continue to get assessed, it really provides a roadmap for how your garage has been performing, and are there areas that are continuing to happen to be addressed, or are things being, maintained within a certain area? Really, the way I would just describe asset management is really more of a strategic or a master plan, specifically on how to maintain your particular facility. And lastly, if you have an asset management plan, it really helps provide with continuity. Are there transitions within your organization? Are there any kinds of changes so that when the next folks may come in line, they understand where the project has been and what the next steps are? From a financial standpoint, I just want to explain this graph really brief. What it's trying to depict is the initial and long-term cost of the structure as it relates to its useful life. So after the garage is planned, designed, and constructed, there are stages that are called renewal. That's just another word for repairs or maintenance throughout the life of the structure. So as you can kind of see, there's regular intervals where that maintenance will occur. And again, it depends, as Blake and Rob mentioned, geographic region, its exposure conditions, how old is it, what is the type of system, right? Its level of durability. So it really depends. But the goal of that is to really meet the 100% effective life as best as you can, and really get the bang for your buck with your asset. In the event that the renewal stages or the repair milestones are not met, that 100% may be something less. And I think that's the challenge, or something we don't want to figure out if we have to get to that point. We really want to maximize what that is. And for the owners out there and the operators, if you're not necessarily hitting these renewal stages, we may not have as much time as we would love to have right now to be proactive, but if an emergency pops up, we always make the time. So that's where it's just a little bit more of building that case to be more proactive will help minimize those type of emergency repairs in the event those are taken into account. And especially, how long will your facility be closed? We haven't really talked about the phasing approach. If you can phase something in to take a certain portion of your garage and repair it, it might be inconvenient for folks, and maybe depending on the time and month of the year, but I'm pretty sure that's not as impactful as closing levels, or God forbid, the entire structure for an emergency type situation. What this graphic is trying to explain, just for briefly here, is just more about the expected roles and responsibilities between an owner and an operator versus more of a technical expert or someone that's contracted. So briefly on the left, those three areas, what we would typically respond or allocate to an owner and operator, what are those administration and management pieces with regards to standard operating procedures with the staff that are actually walking throughout those facilities each and every day? Or is it clear on what their position and what their tasks are? do you have an on-call or a group of folks you can call to look at items, whether that's an assessment or in type of immediate response with some of the images that Rob had showed as well. Of course, owners and operators are responsible for routine and preventative maintenance, which we've talked about. What I do want to hit on is that gray box on the bottom is really, empowering staff, especially those frontline employees that are out there, walking the garages, driving around in golf carts and seeing things. It's a lot, it's better to ask something and determine, is it something that needs to be looked into further, rather than essentially, kicking the can down the road or ignoring something that may have a sign that may be in potential need. And when that actually happens, all the things on the right that you see there are essentially what a technical expert would tend to look at, but not so much to, they would define what are the types of repairs that need to happen, but also then what are the next steps? We understand not everything may need to be repaired at once, but you can kind of see there is a little bit of a organization and priority of putting life safety concerns at the top along with structural deterioration, as obviously those are paramount with assessments and maintenance as it relates to restoration. On the next slide, obviously it's not going to read all the questions here, but the intent here is how well do you know your facilities? As you look at some of these questions, are you able to provide a type of response, about the current condition? How much longer are you trying to have that facility fulfill its useful life? Repairs need to happen and in what order? So while you may or may not know some of these, and I'm sorry, Rachel, I'm looking at that title. That should say assessing your facilities. But
thanks, Hal.
Okay.
Hal's bringing I'll own that, Hal. Thank you.
I'll take you with it, Rachel. I'm not going to let you.
That's one of the ones that spell checker doesn't get, Mark.
But I'm looking at it. I'm like, wait a minute.
Thanks, Hal.
So that was a little bit of a curveball. So anyway, the whole idea is get to know your facilities. And at the end of the day, are you able to answer these questions if your partners, your leadership ask you these questions? Are you in that position? The next slide, Rachel. And this title looks good to me, so nothing to change here. But at the end of the day, what are you trying to budget and plan for? It could be estimated anywhere between $200 to $400 per parking space per year of what you could potentially put into a reserve budget. Again, depends on type, age, location, all that fun stuff. But the whole goal of these past few slides is to hopefully give you enough information to properly plan, so that you can be in that proactive mode rather than the reactive and emergency mode. And then once you're able to, get your place in line for the annual funding, I know different organizations, it might be I'm able to carry over funding, or it might be a use it or lose it type annual funding, or it could be a fixed budget. Here's a fixed amount of dollars you can have every year. How do I best spend this money to repair the facility and what's priority? And all that comes as part of the asset management plan. So I think we're going to turn over now to more of an operations piece with Brett.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so we've had a great kind of overview of a lot of the specifics that we're looking for, strategic planning, budgeting, et cetera. But the daily users, the operations folks who are on the ground, they're the ones who we really need to elevate and educate and lean into hard. And so operationally, number one, it's identify the areas to look at. What specific aspects of some of the slides that Rob shared should you be looking at? And it's going to be specific to the garage. Engaging with one of these folks here or someone within the industry to help you kind of dial into the specifics of your facility will help to identify what to look at, what to look for specifically. But then you have that report, you have the information, it needs to be disseminated. It needs to be explained to the people who are on the ground on a daily basis, who's walking around the facilities and could identify these things. And then give them checklists, give them ways to make that a part of their routine as a critical path. And once that's known, they need to know what to do with that information. So if you see a stalagmite beginning to form, or there's a crack here where it wasn't, or maybe it's a larger crack than it was in previous years, what do they do with that information? So it's great to share the information, give them a path with, know how to recognize it, but then give them a path forward, and then check up on it. Any system needs to be checked up on, and these are, the goal here is to provide a practical means for your operational folks to identify and report, and then you to react to areas that are found. Next. And so we're going to jump into some best practices, kind of summarize what we've run through. But number one, and the word I heard over and over and over again is proactive. If you're reactive, you're too late as it relates to maintenance. You want to be proactive. Look at what's out there. Help define standard operating procedures, and you need to actually do what those best practices are. You need to identify with your employees what to look for. Need to identify a path forward for them. Make sure that they're walking the darker areas of the garage, or the garage the parts of the garage that don't always get traffic, and they're looking around and recording what they see. Scope and perform condition assessments. So every 3 to 5 years, that's a moving target, but in terms of a grouping, 3 to 5 years is a good target to shoot for. And it's going to be more for older facilities or facilities that are in saltier areas, or if you're in winter areas where salts are routinely used. And then you want to make sure you're budgeting for those repairs. And there's lots of commentary going around regarding budgeting. It's a critical thing, and it's very, very easy to ignore during the early years, or if everything looks okay. But that's a piggy bank that you're saving for the future. And so these are the best practices. You could turn it up a level, and we're going to go to the next slide for the ones you get extra credit on. So consistently funding your capital reserve, and doing that on a routine basis, knowing what you're planning for, and doing it year over year over year, and not touching that. It's very easy, or tempting rather, to look at that pool of money and dip into it when you don't need it. But there will come a time and a place where it's needed. And so maintaining that pool of funds is very important. Also, a pool of consultants. Know who to call before you need to call them. And if there's consultants you like working with that are experts in specific areas, make sure that they know you and you know them. And then you have a maintenance manual. Are you really adhering to it? So often things just get stuck on the shelf and they stay there. But take it down, look through it, make sure that you're being proactive in application of what's recommended. And then that document needs to be a living and breathing thing. It's not something that should sit on the shelf. It should be updated as new equipment comes into play, as codes are updated. It's something to be routinely reviewed, even just on an annual basis, and updated as needed. With that, turn it over to, we're going to stick around for some more Q&A, and we're here for a while longer. I know we have a few other questions that have come in, and I'll try to read through them. Let's see. Can the panel discuss the importance of concrete cover over top steel in cast-in-place placement for garage durability? And that's a question that is firmly to the panel.
I could feel that one real easily. Yeah, the ACI 362.1, which is the guide for the design and construction of durable parking structures, has some great recommendations in there. ACI 318 has some prescriptive recommendations based on exposure. Generally speaking, for most parts of the South, other than the coastal regions, something in the neighborhood of 1 to 1.5 inches of cover is probably sufficient. For the central states, 1.5 is better. That's from the top surface to the first edge of the rebar, is what that's talking about. And then for the upper Midwest and the mountain states and the northeastern states, it's 2 inches is the standard.
Thank you. Interested in best practices, checks for after guests with oversized vehicles hit the top of the garage. So heavier vehicles on the top of the garage. And I know this was a topic of discussion with the group previously, and looking at how EVs impact the overall weight of vehicles, and also discussion around, do they burn hotter? How do you put out the fires? How does that change existing assets?
I'll jump in there.
Yeah.
You know, maybe to start about the weight itself, and I know our entire panel has had some good discussion about EVs and the weights and all that. So, I mean, you know, kind of jumping to the end, I mean, it is something our industry is looking at, you know, pretty actively and thoroughly. I think there is actually a few organizations that are looking at some research and white papers to be issued, I think sometime this next month or two. So it's actually coming out. But that being said, you know, a lot of the things that we are looking at as a group here collectively through the industry is, you know, what are the impacts? You know, yes, you know, sometimes those vehicles could be heavier than your typical combustion engine. But yeah, I think you need to take a step back and understand, you know, what is the lay of the land? How many EVs are actually in your facility? Is there a congested area where these are actually being placed and used also at the same time? So I think it is a case by case basis as it appears right now, and depending again how dense of an area EVs are actually placed and how often they're used. But with regards to, as you know, the codes today do have, you know, are reasonably conservative with the loads that are used. But like anything that is gaining momentum and gaining ground, it is something to be aware of. And that's what some of these white papers and industry organizations are looking at now. But as far as your typical condition, for the most part, garages are generally designed to have a reasonable margin of safety to accept some of these loads.
And then, Mark, I'll answer the first part of the question. If you have an oversized vehicle come in and strike some part of your structure, that's probably a time you call your on-call consultant. I know personally, our group has looked at many of those. Normally U-Haul vans are a culprit, or box trucks are a culprit, but because you may not know, you may look at it and it doesn't look like it's damaged, but it could be. So.
Just a note, we talked about in our preparation that as you were thinking about, I need to update my maintenance manual, or maybe it's time for condition assessment, those things that were on the right side of the screen that move beyond your responsibility, but when to call in a professional, those are great questions to ask. What's my EV loading going to be? What are my fire concerns? Because it is so specific to your climate, your placement, your facility. But so as you can ping those questions onto your scope for your, you know, desired consultant. But I'll go back to Brett to get to as many of our questions as we have left.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. So the question was, tell me a bit about best practices for precast washdowns, power pressure washing versus full ramp fire hose down. So there's a few things at play there, and I'll give my opinion, then offer to the rest of the group if we may. Number one, it relates going back to the salts, and you know, the frequency with cleanliness. It relates to aesthetics. How clean does a facility need to be or need to appear, but also removing the salts. So if you're putting salt down during the winter, or you're near the ocean, it needs to be done more frequently than if you're not. But also, there's EPA guidance around what to do with washdowns, and that water needs to be collected. So generally speaking, in some states are more rigorously enforced or applied than others, but you should not be rinsing that down the drains. That water needs to be collected and treated before it's put down. So just a fire hose wash down, I don't know how appropriate that would be.
Yeah, a lot of municipalities and areas have requirements for treating the water. So absolutely, most of the time these days, it's a third party contractor that's doing it. We generally advocate for low pressure, higher volume, just because you don't want to damage the concrete or rip out the joint sealants, and And there's a trade-off there. You get a little deeper cleaning with a higher pressure, but generally speaking, we're advocating for a little bit more water, a little lower pressure. I don't think that there's any specifically different approaches to washing down a precast deck versus any other type of deck. I think they're all, concrete is generally concrete. Having some sort of degreaser or agent to help remove some of the oils and whatnot off the surface is helpful as well. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Brett, that these days most municipalities require that you capture all that water.
Continuing on, how big of a difference does using alternative melting agents such as magnesium chloride instead of salt make? So those are related.
I touched on that a little earlier. They don't typically the non-chloride melters don't have quite as low an operating temperature. So once you get down in the real cold areas, they don't work. But they are better in terms of being less corrosive or non-corrosive, but they are much more expensive. You know that, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's another line item to budget for. And then I think one of my favorite questions: how to prevent donuts on the top levels.
So I'll jump in there.
Yeah.
So I'll kind of start backwards, but we have been involved in certain, have been brought in emergency type repairs, unfortunately, where that resulting in that event, unexpected, did damage throughout the floor. It actually dislodged a guardrail panel. So there are some of those things that happen, and I'll tee it up to Rob and Blake. But at least in our experience of how to prevent it, we've actually gone to the point where you actually are putting physical barriers to not go up to those floors that are wide open, because signage, cones, things that could be moved. We actually talked about putting physical, and we're talking heavy barriers, whether that's water filled or those kind of concrete jersey barriers to prevent vehicles from going up there. That's a potential means of preventing that. But at the end of the day, it also, there's an enforcement component, but to physically stop the cars is probably what I would say. Rob or Blake, I don't know if you have alternatives to that too.
Yeah, you have to enforce.
Yep.
So cameras, that's a challenge. That's a challenging one. Maybe quit going to fast
skateboarders too. Bikes and skateboarders too. Same sort of deal.
Yeah.
Speed bumps that go the full length. So I guess right now, and we can come back around to the questions, but I know we did have a ending survey and some housekeeping to do. We could turn it over to that, and I'm sure most, if not all of us, can stick around for a few more minutes to answer additional questions.
Thanks so much, Brett. So we're thrilled you were able to participate with us today. We have a couple of more notes, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some more of your questions either over email or through other resources. We want to know what you want to talk about. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in this topic and ongoing safety topics as it's important. A lot of interest in EVs, of course, but want to hear from you. If this list doesn't include what you want to hear, I'm going to pop my email in the chat. You can reach out to me or any of the IPMI team to sort of voice what you would like to learn more about. I am thrilled to see that our ADA and accessibility guidelines are coming up on top, at least right this moment. We are planning a new symposium on October 23rd. We are going to pop that link in the chat for you. We might not get it in the live chat, but you'll definitely get it in your inbox with our summary. It's going to be exactly like this one, with experts talking about how to do your best to serve not only accessible patients with accessibility needs, but also transportation equity needs. So this is the kind of thing that IPMI is, of course, thrilled to bring to you. Before we close today, and I'll go into some other notes, I just want to give a big thank you to our panelists who had approximately 1 week to prepare all this information. So I hope that you appreciate their effort. As I said, you will receive a copy of the deck and the recording, and you can share that with your team. You could host an internal training with your team to show them what to look out for, all of that great stuff. Thank you so much for weighing in on that poll question. It really does help us shape our content. So we know this is the beginning, not the ending. That we leave more questions unanswered, of course, than we were able to answer today, but hopefully we were able to give you a primer. Lots and lots of resources here, including our textbook publication, our magazine every month has safety and consulting information in it. And of course, the annual conference and expo in June has a comprehensive education program that features this kind of content as well. The best way to become as knowledgeable as you can in this or any other aspect is, of course, the CAPP program. So we encourage all of you to investigate that to become one of those industry professionals with us. So please do go ahead and save the date, October 23rd. You will receive that registration link, and Rita is sharing all kinds of links in the chat for you. And I see a special thank you from Sean Conrad, our CEO, of course, Gary Means, our chair, and our entire board of directors for your time today. Thank you so much to our presenters. Have a great rest of your day.